All right, welcome everybody. It is Gene. I'm going to do a video today about flows in the legacy PC-12. I've had a couple requests for this one, so I'm in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and I've got the Coronado PC-12 loaded up here. This is a Legacy Series 10, which means most of the switches are up here on the overhead panel. So I am just going to walk you through the flows for this airplane, and for those of you who aren't familiar with flows, flows are memory do lists, meaning we don't actually use a checklist as a read and do. We walk through the panel, flip the switches by memory, and then go back and use a checklist to make sure we didn't miss anything. And this is the way most turbine aircraft are operated. So here I am in the cold and dark PC-12. I'm on the ramp here in beautiful Astoria, Oregon. And we'll just assume that the pre-flight walk-around inspection is done, the chocks are pulled, we've got the parking brake set, passengers loaded in, all the bags are loaded in, we're fueled up and ready to start the airplane. And we'll do this one with no GPU, so this will be a battery start. And so I'll just walk you through it. So the first thing I'm going to do is a receiving flow. And the receiving flow is the first flow that we do when we get into the airplane. Normally this would be done before the passengers arrive, but we'll just pretend for today that we're going to do it at this point. So I'm going to hide the yoke just to make sure we can see all the switches. And I'm going to start over here on the left-hand circuit breaker panel. And I'm just going to make sure all these circuit breakers are in, which they are. And I'm going to move over here to my mask mic switch, make sure that that is in the mic position. So this switch is used to toggle the input for the microphone if we had our mask on, if we lost pressurization and we needed to talk through the mask, we would flip this switch up to mask. So we always want that in mic for normal operations. Come over here, make sure my parking brake is set. You do have to prime these brakes in the PC-12, meaning we have to actually apply brake pressure to the pedals as we pull that handle out and rotate it to lock it. So that is set. Come over here, make sure our ELT switch is in the armed position, which it is. And then come down here to these switches for the EFIS and EPS and AHRS. So the EFIS is the Electronic Flight Information System, or these two instruments here, the Attitude Direction Indicator and the EHSI. And this switch needs to be in norm. So there are two settings for it, norm and composite. Composite would only be used during abnormal operations if one of the displays were to fail. So these are CRT displays, they do go bad sometimes. If we lost one of these screens, I could flip this switch to composite and it would pile everything into just one of the displays. So both the attitude indicator and the HSI would be combined into one of those screens. So that should be in norm for normal operations. The EPS, this switch would normally be set to off once we got in the airplane. Now if this were actually unarmed and this light was out, that would mean that we had a dead battery, which would be a no-go. That would be a no-fly scenario, so that would not be good. So I've noticed in the sim when you get in they have this set to armed, which is not how it would be in the real airplane. So that would normally be set to off. And this is a good time to go ahead and just test the battery for the EPS. The EPS is the emergency power supply. I have a video about that I'll link to here if you want to check that out. But we'll just hold the switch to the test position. And what would happen in the real airplane is this green battery test light would illuminate, and we want to hold that down for 5 seconds to make sure that light doesn't go out. And then after that, we would put this up to armed, and this amber light for EPS on would illuminate. So what we're doing is we're just testing the battery in the EPS to make sure that it's nice and charged, and then we're arming the system. With the rest of the electrical system off in the airplane, we want this EPS light to be illuminated to tell us that the EPS is working, that the EPS will automatically come online when the rest of the electrical system is turned off or has failed in the airplane. So this isn't modeled correctly in the sim, but that's how that switch works in real life. So again, and actually, like I said, at this point, we would hold this down to test, and we would have this green light come on, which is not modeled correctly in the sim. You actually have to have the battery turned on, I noticed, for this light to illuminate, which is not realistic. But normally we would hold that down for 5 seconds and then go up to armed, and that amber light would come on. So we'll just turn the battery back off for now. We'll come back to that in a minute, but I'm going to leave that on armed. All of the rest of these switches for the AHRS should be down. So we want the AHRS 1 and 2 both in slave. Now these CW and CCW switches can be either up or down. It actually doesn't really matter, but if they're all down, it's just easy to remember. But these just rotate the EHSI clockwise or counterclockwise when they're in free DG mode. But normally we want these slaved so that we don't have to automatically, or not automatically, so we don't have to manually align those with the magnetic compass in the airplane. So these should all be down. And then we want to come over here and make sure that we have the gear handle in the down position. Once we turn the battery on, we should see 3 green lights to indicate that the gear is down and locked. And then we'll come across and turn on the oxygen lever here. So this is the supplemental oxygen. There's a big oxygen bottle in the aircraft, and this lever here just turns that oxygen supply to the masks on in case we were to need that in flight. And then we'll come down here and check our trim interrupt switches. These would normally be set down to norm, and they are guarded. As you can see, this little plexiglass guard over the switches. These don't normally get touched unless we have an abnormal situation or an emergency. So these are not normally set to the interrupt position like they are in the sim when you first load up the airplane. They're normally in norm, but you do want to double check that. So we'll put those in norm. These are just used to interrupt the trim if you have a runaway trim, or the flaps if you have an asymmetric flap deployment. You could use those switches to interrupt movement of the trim or the flaps if you needed to. So those should be in norm. We'll come over here to our alternate trim, and this should just be in the center position, not down or up. The alternate stab trim would be used if you had a normal stab trim failure, and this uses the autopilot servo. So that should just be in the center position like that. The Morse should be stowed and locked. The PCL should be all the way back to the idle stop. And then I'm going to move it just for a second so that we can see the condition lever here. That should be in the feather cutoff position, which it is. Flaps should be up. They could also be at 15. That would be fine as well. And then we'll just check the position of our interior lights. For daytime, they can all be off like they are here, and then the rest of the lights can be off. Some guys like to leave the reading lights on for the reading lights in the back in the cabin, just at all times. Those are controlled by individual manual switches in the back for the passengers, so that they have the option of turning those on whenever they want. So that can be, wherever you want it. And then down here, we have a couple of paddles, one for the fuel firewall shutoff, the ECS shutoff, and then the manual gear extension handle, and those should all be in and flush, which they are. Then I'm going to work my way over here to the ECS and pressurization. So we want the ECS to be off, not in auto. We want the cabin pressurization dump switch to be in auto and guarded. Set your temperature to where you want it. I'm just going to put it kind of at neutral for today. And then our manual temperature switch should just be guarded like it is. No changes there necessary. And then for my pressurization, at this point, I would set this to my cruise altitude that I had planned plus 500 feet. So let's say I was going to go up to flight level 230. I would set this to 235 on the inner scale. And for whatever reason, Coronado modeled this to where you can't actually rotate this thing unless the battery's turned on, which is not realistic, but this is why you can see the knob rotating and the scales aren't moving. But if I come up here and I turn the battery on, now I can rotate it. So I'll just set that up to 235, right about there. Turn that back off for now, and it goes back to where it was. But I think that will save so that when we turn the battery back on, that will go back to 235. And then I'm also going to set my cabin rate of climb to the neutral position. This is not modeled correctly in the sim. Normally this arrow would go to the 12 o'clock position, not the 6 o'clock position, but we'll leave it there because that's how it's modeled in here. And then over on the co-pilot side, again, the EFIS2 should be in norm. And then I'm going to check the same things on the right-hand panel over here. So the mic mask switch is in mic, and then all the circuit breakers on the right-hand circuit breaker panel should be in. And then I'm going to work my way up to the overhead panel. And at this point, I'm going to turn on battery 1 and battery 2. I would check my battery voltages first. So I want to see at least 24 volts on those batteries. So I have 24.3, 24.4, that's good. The nav lights should be on. Those are usually left on. And then at this point, I would perform a lamp test. So if I push and hold that button, all of the lights that can light up, light up. And I'm just checking to make sure nothing's burned out on the cause or any of these other lights. So those look good. And in the sim, I think this will just sort of time out after 5 or 10 seconds. There it goes. And then I would also test my fire system, which is not modeled correctly in here. Well, it's not modeled at all. I don't think you can even push that button. But normally in the real airplane, you would hold that down and you would get a master warning and then an aural fire enunciation. We want all the rest of the exterior lights turned off for now. We don't need anything on but the nav lights. My fuel pumps I am going to test. So we're checking for 2 things when we cycle these fuel pumps. First, that I get a cause light down here that shows that the fuel pump is running. And I think this is modeled backwards in the sim. I think when this is turned to auto, yeah, you do get the enunciation. And when you turn it on, it goes off, which is not correct. So normally when anytime the fuel pump is running, you should get a green cause light that lets you know it's running. So that's modeled backwards. But anyway, so I would turn that to on, I would check for the cause light, and then I would also listen for the pump. You can hear it running to make sure that it's running. Turn that back to auto, and then on the right-hand side, I would do the same thing. Check for the light, and then check for the sound, and then back to auto. Check to make sure the ignition is in auto. And then we're going to come over here and make sure the generators are both off. So Gen 1 is off, Gen 2 is off, external power is off because the GPU is not connected. Avionics buses 1 and 2 are off. The non-essential override we want in auto, which is not actually movable in the sim here. It's just a fixed switch. And then our inverter we would switch. So there are 2 inverters on the airplane, one on Gen 1, one on the BAT. And we just switch it each time so that the inverters are getting even wear. So it doesn't really matter. There's no operational difference between the 2. We just cycle at each flight so that they're getting even wear. And then I would turn on my standby bus here if I wanted to pre-program the avionics. So I'll go ahead and do that today. So that's going to turn on comm and nav 1, give us a radio to call and get our clearance, and then also the GPS. Not exactly modeled correctly in here, but that's how it works in the real airplane. And then also up here, my master power switch should be on and guarded. So this is an emergency switch that we would use if we had an electrical fire. We would just reach up here, lift this guard, turn that switch to off, and that would just kill all of the electronics in the airplane in an effort to try to stop an electrical fire. All right, moving right along to the de-icing panel. Want to make sure that my boots are turned off, my prop heat is turned off, and then my inertial separator I do want open for the start, so I'm going to push that button to open that up. That takes about 30 seconds to open in the real airplane. And then I'm going to move over here to my windshield heat. I want both of these on light, and they should both be turned off. And then also my probe heat should be off for now as well. And then down here to the cooling system, I want the system off. I can pre-select how I'm going to run this if I want to at this point, so I can turn on the VCCS, which is the air conditioning in the airplane if I want, or just leave it on recirc, and I can select vent or vent plus flood, high or low, etc. But the main thing that I'm checking for at this point is just to make sure that that system is off for the start. And then I would turn on my no smoking and seatbelt signs right there, and then make sure my cabin heating is off. So that is my receiving flow for the airplane, and then I would back that up with my paper checklist to make sure I didn't miss anything, which I'm not going to do for the purposes of this video. This is just teaching you the flow. And then I would move on to the before start flow and checklist after this. All right, guys, stay tuned for more flows. I'm going to do a series of videos and a playlist here for all of the flows for the Legacy, and then hopefully if there's ever an NG sim that comes out one of these days, I can show you that as well. All right, thanks for watching, guys. Leave me your questions in the comments, and I will see you on the next video.